This podcast is brought to you by PLI, the Practicing Law Institute. PLI is committed to keeping you ever current on topics that matter to you, like artificial intelligence. Learn more at pli.edu/AIPod.
Welcome to AI and Data Law, part of the PLI Evercurrent podcast. I'm William Tanenbaum, host of the podcast and head of AI and data practice at Moses & Singer in New York. In this series, we bring you the latest perspectives on AI and data through timely talks with thought leaders working at the intersection of AI, data, and the law. In this episode, my guest is Suneil Thomas, managing counsel at Google AI, and our topic is the evolving landscape of generative AI. So anyhow, it's good to see you again, Suneil, and I know we've had a great chance to have some good conversations, and now here we are, get a chance to dive into some serious AI stuff. So I think what would be good for us to talk and share about with the audience is have you kind of give a survey and let us know, where AI is, kind of how we got here, and the different part of the current landscape, and to the extent you want to talk about what you see immediately over the horizon, we'd love to hear that. And the first thing, let's just start with a little bit of your background. So Suneil is at Google, and why don't you tell us what you're doing there and how you got to here?
Yeah, sure. So it's almost been a decade at Google. I've been in the cloud division that whole time, and it's grown quite a bit, including the legal team. And for the last, how long has it been? I guess it's 3 years or so. I've been managing the cloud product counsel team. Product counsel, that's a role that's, I'm pretty sure originated at Google, but it's in most tech companies now. And you basically act like a general counsel of a product division and various product lines. And that's what myself and my team does. And in particular, it's for the AI division within cloud. So that's Google's enterprise level AI tools and services and solutions that we sell, business to business, as opposed to our consumer side. But there's a lot of crossover, obviously. Yeah. And
give us a little background of your career arc about how Google was lucky enough to have you end up in this position.
Yeah, I think when cloud was first starting, I think what was appealing about me is that I was the general counsel of a marine drone company. And just because of the realities of being a marine drone, you have to rely a lot on cloud computing for various parts of the data we were collecting and transmitting and all that sort of stuff. So I was familiar with being a company that was a relatively large cloud customer and in a complicated manner. And we were some early deployers of AI just for our navigation systems and things. But before that, my career, I know, Bill, you and I have joked around about it. There's not a real linear line. You can look at my LinkedIn. I did some corporate securities work. I did corporate real estate work at a law firm. I was a lobbyist for a while. Kind of this meandering path where I always was, I think the only consistent thing, following my interests. But this, kind of serendipity, it's all really come together for AI and what I work on, because it is it has multidisciplinary impacts, especially the generative AI topic we'll talk about today. And I feel that my various experiences in different types of markets and different types of roles helps me see around the corner a bit. And I think that's a lot about being an AI attorney right now, because the law is evolving so rapidly, and frankly, press narratives can be as significant as legal judgments in some contexts. So you just have to have a real good situational awareness, and more, I think, important than anything, a solid sense of what you don't know. And I think my meandering career has helped in that way.
Sounds like the lobbying skills are still with you.
Yeah, they are. I work a lot with our government relations team, which is, obviously very top notch at Google, but I feel like at times it's helpful that I understand core aspects of their job and can speak the similar language, which is important.
Yeah. All right. I'll have to tell you this, the very, very beginning of cloud, when it was a gleam in some guy's eye in the CTO's office and no one really knew what it was. We were sitting around a table. I don't know, must have been 50 people around this table for various reasons, which I'm not going to go into. And halfway through, one guy goes, "This is really exciting. Get the corporate jet. I want to go see the cloud." And so we didn't, but we went on. So at this point, just as a kind of a segue into the AI landscape, let's take a medium dive into AI tech. And I hope I don't embarrass you, but I know in GPT, the T came from some of the work that Google did quite a while ago. So I'll let you have a starting point to why it's G, why it's P, why it's T, and how that connects the dots to where it is and where it's going.
Yeah, I think and I'll keep this very high level, partly because I don't want to over-represent my technical knowledge. There's endless treatises you can find on the internet, or you can ask Bard or ChatGPT. but also I think it's, assuming this audience is going to be mainly lawyers, I think it's helpful. I kind of advise my team that in terms of the work we do, it almost is important not to get too technical, to be able to understand things in relatively plain English, or be able to translate it well, because otherwise I feel that when lawyers try to get too technical in their communications with each other, like things can get pretty derailed, honestly, because both parties might not be really understanding each other and maybe a little bit too embarrassed to admit that. So what I'm about to say will be with that in mind. But I think the biggest area and shift we've seen in, let's just say, the last year and a half has been from inference, prediction-based AI. So inference being, you show a model a picture of a cat and it tells you that's a cat. Just understanding of data input you give a model. And prediction, which is maybe, based on something you show the model or instruct the model, it gives you its best guess, statistical guess about what to do next. And what's happened is that we've just gone from that to generative AI. I mean, everyone hears that word all the time. And the generative is just very literal. It's just output that's creatively generative in a manner that you just didn't see with the prior generation of prediction and inference, which is still highly useful and highly relevant. Like, that is one thing that I feel like in some ways this shift is dramatic, but it's not like that old AI isn't still all through our lives and will continue to be. But the biggest thing with these large language models, LLMs, I think is the first thing that someone probably hears about when they start digging into generative AI. I think a simple way to try and understand that is that we have had chatbots and virtual assistants for quite some time. Everyone's familiar with Siri and Google Assistant and et cetera, et cetera. And those have always taken a text input, whether that has to be translated from your voice or whether it's straight from you typing, and taking that and converting it into essentially numbers that are either tokens and vectors, and then making statistical analysis about what's next, right? And what's just happened here is that's just been ramped up to such a significant capacity in terms of the training data that those statistical connections are based on with deep neural networks.
Let's dive into that. That's the key thing that goes from Siri, Alexa, to where we are.
Yes, and this will be, generative AI models will be behind all those branded names and new brands, but in a grossly oversimplified way, those things have been limited in the amount of input it can digest at one time, and the output that it's giving you, and the correlations made between the input and the output. Now it can digest, an LLM can digest, one of the larger, more significant ones you're seeing, can digest such a large amount of input and make, statistical guesses based on that input, and then draw from a large, database, so to speak, of relationships between that they've determined based on, a lot of training data about what the best output is, right? So instead of just focusing on one word and what the next word is, it can focus on, the context of a whole sentence or a whole paragraph. And then it can spit out things that are just so much more long form. And even if it's not just text, right? I mean, I think that the easiest thing is text, but that interface can then also allow it to create images, right? But it's still the same thing where I think some people think that LLMs and other forms of generative AI models are just like retrieving data it's been trained on in its original form. And that's not the case at all. It's that the models translated all those things into numerical data points, and then can just make increasingly complex like relationship decisions based on those data points and the input it gets, and then transform in some ways all of that, which is the T in transformer models, into just output that's just captured all of our imagination. I mean, I think describing it as jarring has been pretty accurate. The complexity and the creativity of the output that you're getting from various forms of generative AI, it's been jarring in that it's really caught the zeitgeist of popular culture. Like, I mean, I feel like you have more people diving into what was really the like realm of kind of tech nerds, and now it's becoming more common parlance, and it is because I think the output in some ways seems human.
So some of the, as you say, some of the output's really quite impressive and beyond what you would think even some real people can do when they're creating art. But I do think I want to explore with you whether there's some boundary that puts some limits, or I'm going back with boundary. There's a boundary around the extent to which the content that's generated can't take huge steps beyond the model on which it's based.
Yeah, I think some of that is still being discovered, especially as the models get larger. I think as they get larger, we're noticing connections that might not have been as predicted up front, and capabilities that you might not necessarily address directly to the training data itself, but just what the model's been able to learn. So there's been examples where I think some models have been shown an ability to converse or understand or translate certain languages that there wasn't a ton of that of that specific language in the training data, but the model was able to make some connections between perhaps similar data. But generally, I think you're right. And I think as these very large language models have been trained on a lot of the publicly available data that we're aware of, to more performance, you kind of need to have more tuning of the models. And that's in like the broad sense of tuning, right? Like you could have more human interaction with the models. You could have more humans annotating and rating responses. And, that's almost kind of supervised aspect models can improve, or the models themselves can do unsupervised learning of their own, with another model helping them learn. You actually have like tuning in the technical sense, where you can tune a model with additional data. In my opinion, that's where I think the market will go. The enterprise market will go significantly, because you have a lot of companies and institutions with really interesting amounts of data that can not only serve their businesses better if they're able to, further train a large language model for maybe their specific business needs, potentially turn into offerings that they might want to bring to market themselves.
Yeah, so let's explore tuning a little bit. So it's really, in my mind, kind of an aspect of an enterprise's internal use of an LLM, and trying to make it more able to do tasks that company needs to have done as part of whatever it considers to be either its core operational business or making call centers a profit center instead of a cost center.
Yeah.
Am I right on tuning in that respect?
Oh, yeah, I think that's definitely not wrong. I think there could be.
I'm going to have to remember that. Not wrong. That's good.
I think there could be just more than that, in that I think some companies, as the friction, I'll hype my own platform, but if you came to, the Vertex platform on Google Cloud, our competitors have analogous offerings. If you have a valuable data set, you can further fine tune our offerings, and then it's not a ton of friction to then just offer your own API. I think charging for that and supporting that and other things, I think the barriers around that will start to come down, just like you saw the barriers to e-commerce come down. So I think there will be more smaller players, even if those players are significant companies, but smaller players than these main hyperscalers, these main cloud providers that are significantly market players in terms of their own offerings.
Sorry, let's go back a step. You mentioned APIs. That's going to trigger my mind for plugins. And you talked about having companies using APIs to have an interface, which I presume is with their business partners. That's not on everybody's radar as to what Bard or ChatGPT does. So what's the difference?
I think again, this is just my guess, and it's definitely not, Google's marketing stance or anything like that. But I personally think that you're going to have broad-based consumer offerings that are like ChatGPT or Bard or, et cetera, et cetera. But I also think, customers will have their own tuned versions of the models underlying that technology with their data that they can, like you said, use for their own purposes, or they can stand up an interface that others can access for their purposes. And, I think the marketplaces for this that will be hosted probably by the main cloud providers to start, but perhaps others that will facilitate all of this. And I think it'll follow some things that we've seen in just e-commerce general, where the barriers to entry of other people offering their own generative AI services for more niche things will grow.
So one of that would be like really sophisticated customer service, right, for companies to do that. And then another thing would be, if I'm a customer of company X and company X is a customer of Google or Microsoft, between the two of them, customer without the API could come in and use I don't know whose it is, but can use a new iteration of a generative AI model that focuses on what wants to buy and what that enterprise wants to sell.
Yes, exactly. Like maybe a large language model that's really tuned for a specific market or application or interaction. So maybe it's one that is really fluent to talking to the mining industry about, and those kinds of employees about the various things that you need answers for, that you need processing. And it's trained on data from a company like that has, decades of interactions and things like that. That offering might be in partnership, or maybe just on its own. That company might offer that to their own market vertical, to some of their competitors, if the price is right, so to speak. Yeah.
So when you're talking training here, are you talking tuning?
Yeah, so there's different, when we talk about it internally, we kind of reference like full fine tuning, where you take like a copy of the model and you basically train it with the other additional data source. And that can be pretty resource intensive and has other complications, but it's a possibility. But then you can also do adaptive layer tuning, which you basically have another layer of, and weights. I think weights are thrown around a lot, but that's literally how the model is weighting, certain statistical signals over others in terms of importance and getting you the output that's desired. But a customer can essentially layer their own custom weights in an adaptive layer over a base model. And what's kind of cleaner about that is that it's a little easier to segregate what's happening with the additional data versus what's happened with the initial training data for the foundation. That can be sensitive and, something that you probably, if you're offering that, you have more sensitivity about what can be done with it, where it can be taken. And whereas a customer can do things in the adaptive layer that's much more within their control and in a manner that whoever's offering the foundation model can be more comfortable with. It doesn't necessarily impact the foundational model except in the way that the customer wants for their own purpose.
So now let's turn back to the APIs for a second. Customer X, regardless of who gave it the LLM and which LLM, let's just put that issue aside for a second. So it's got one, it's tuned it, it's ready to go to market. It's got an API, and I'm picking up on what you said before. So now its customer has its own LLM with an adaptive layer and it's tuned. So you've got basically a connection between two generative AI technologies. Is that right? Is that not wrong?
I'm trying to figure out what the two models are. So are you talking about the foundation model and then the adaptive layer, or?
No, I'm not clear. I was talking about each company is fine-tuned the model. So their company X is fine-tuned model.
Yes.
Let's just call that model X. There's company B model. So that's model B. All right. You got they're using these models to conduct business in a way they didn't do it a year ago for whatever their corporate reasons. And now there's some advantage to them doing something with each other. You're going to tell me the something, and the how they do it with something depends at least on part on an API.
Yeah.
Okay. So explain to everybody what an API is and where it comes from.
Yeah. So it literally stands for Application Program Interface. And I think of it as the easiest way for a customer or an end user to embed something in their application that calls something else that can be significantly more complex or bigger and hosted in the cloud. And so I think APIs have kind of transformed what you can do with apps and how much easier it is to build apps, because you can build an app that's relatively simple, but then you can embed it with APIs that, are not totally out of the box, but take a lot less engineering sophistication than ever to access like much more complicated resources that are hosted in the cloud. So, APIs can do a lot of things, but I think the simplest thing about them is its connections to resources in the cloud that are put in, your application.
So does my hypo make sense then, that you've got two companies connecting their operations between, just to go back to Model X and Model Y, through an API?
Yeah, I think where we see the flip side is where we see a lot of concern now from customers. Like they want to know that if they do something, whether it's fully fine tuning or adaptive layer tuning, that they're in control of that and that they only get the benefit of that, and that, Google or whoever the cloud company is or their competitors, don't have access to those improvements and unless they've agreed to that, because they've seen some value in that, where the value can be offered in numerous ways. And so I think that's a really nice thing about adaptive layer tuning, is that you can give customers reassurances that they can really invest in customizing an offering you have in a way that they can feel safe and secure about. But then if they choose to share that adaptive layer with another party or work with another party on a joint adaptive layer, that's completely possible. But it's just, it starts from, I think, a nice base of control and transparency That's getting increasingly important to enterprise customers the more they understand this whole picture in terms of advantages, risks, value. Customers are going to want more and more control of their environments and their improvements to anything you offer.
So that's pretty interesting. So what I'm hearing you say is that the adaptive layer makes it worth to make an investment in the tech however you get to the adaptive layer and however you populate it, because it takes a lot. And it's worth the investment if it's going to yield a meaningful business outcome.
Yeah.
Then you have this business outcome and you've embedded stuff in it or let it act upon or generate or some combination of the both, something specific to the company that its competitors should not have access to. And the adaptive layer will enable that. And that's another reason to invest in it.
Yes, it's definitely a reason to invest in it. And sometimes you see, and this is not just a generative AI market dynamic. This is, I think, existed since the beginning of enterprise AI offerings. But sometimes customers, especially in certain verticals, they understand the benefit of a bigger pie, so to speak. So they understand that the product gets better for everyone if everyone kind of shares their improvements and in a compliant way. You have to be careful about what data you're using and your permissions and things like that. But assuming you get past all of that, and I think you've seen some of that in the security space, for example. I think there's an understanding that the better a threat detection model gets based on the more it sees from all its customers, the better it is for all the customers, right? But there's other verticals where, again, just getting back, I know the oil and gas industry, for example, incredibly competitive, incredibly protective of information they may have that their competitors don't have. So that might not have the same appeal in that vertical. But I think it just depends on the vertical. I've seen it go both ways in the retail vertical. I feel like sometimes, for example, it depends on exactly what it is, but I think retailers, for example, LLMs can really help with more what we would think of maybe as a little bit more basic and maybe not quite generative, but just more search functionality of your websites. Like a lot of times when you go to a website, you'll type in something that you're trying to find on your favorite brand's website, and it won't be the best experience. Like sometimes it is. And if it is, again, a shameless plug, they might be using some of our great offerings in Google Cloud. But if it isn't, they might be using something else. But LLMs can just make that search even better. And some retailers understand that, there's just a certain amount of sharing between them makes that better for all of them. But there's other functionality that I think people will want to maintain real competitive silos around, so to speak.
Yeah, that makes sense. So now we've got the tech that kind of enables that if I focused on the adaptive layer better, right? Because then you can keep the proprietary stuff in the layer.
Exactly.
So to speak.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's really going to unlock a lot of creativity in the enterprise space. Like right now, I think you're seeing a lot of creativity in the individual space and maybe in the smaller business space and how they're using these. Again, I'm kind of calling it foundation models, these big models, whether they're ChatGPT branded or in OpenAI, or whether it's Claude and Anthropic, or whether it's Palm is the current branding that we have on the enterprise space for our LLM and cloud, Google Cloud. You're seeing, or Bard on the consumer side, you're seeing creativity there with individuals. But I think the next level is you're going to see creativity with businesses. Businesses are going to bring their own data and they're going to come up with more specialized offerings based on how they adaptive layer and tune these foundation models and other customization techniques.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a fascinating world when it makes, we'll probably in version 2.0 pretty soon. So let's jump ahead. I mean, if you look to 2025, what's your guess as to what it's going to look like, to say a year from now or a year and a half?
In terms of what type of generative AI companies are going to mainly be using? Well, and I definitely don't want to get into much of this specifically here, but some of it will be determined for better or worse by the regulatory and litigation environments and the resolution of some things that are happening right now. Because I think that will adjust the risk calculus of what you want to do as a company. But I think, the safe things will be, especially as the regulatory environment, if the regulatory environment's not going to get less complex between now and 2025. And I don't think it's going to get less conservative. And that's my guess.
Yeah.
So if you base it on that, I think the applications that are farther away from having, a quote unquote, really high risk to any individual end user that could be either directly involved with the application or the results of the application could just impact them based on a decision that's made or things like that. I think if it's high risk in terms of some significantly negative impact that could happen to that end user, it's going to become increasingly challenging between now and 2025 to enter that space. There's going to be more and more testing that needs to be done, explanations of how the models work, more human in the loop kind of probably involvement and escalation, third party audits, this and that. So it's not to say that won't happen, but I think between now and 2025, the use of this in highly regulated spaces like medicine and finance, and I think that will still be trying to get going. There'll be some really interesting things happening, but maybe not quite at huge scale. But I think in terms of just like what you said, again, I think customer service is highly likely. I mean, it's already happening. People are already interacting frequently with chatbots, whether they're on the phone or whether they're on a website. And those are just going to get better, and they're going to be more and more helpful. They're going to be able to draw on bigger and bigger knowledge bases that the customer can provide it, or frankly, maybe not need them because they can have just a better understanding of the interactions they're having, the language interactions they're having, and the responses they're able to make. So I think customer service is really, that's probably the biggest area I see between now and 2025. And again, customer service in areas that aren't as life and death. I think customer service or ambulance dispatch or something
Right.
that might be a little bit more complicated than customer service or, with your favorite retailer. But I think the design space is fascinating. I think, the image and video and music space, that between now and 2025, I actually don't have great guesses on where that will be. I have guesses on where it could be. I mean, I think you're already seeing, I was just reading the other day that Spotify has, significant amount of new songs being added to their library every day that are all AI generated or AI remixed,
Really?
And so I think the barriers to entry in terms of being a creator of content have already been so significantly lowered with technology. I mean, just this podcast right now. I mean, this is something that, I don't know, I think as little as maybe 15 years ago, maybe less, was a heck of a lot more challenging than what we're pulling off here. We'll see how well it sounds and looks. But you need a studio and this and that. And we probably have to be in the same place, all that kind of stuff. I think this is just a next level in terms of just how someone who doesn't have maybe a lot of independent core creative skill can still create very interesting images and melodies and I think you're going to see more video. I think maybe that might be one of the biggest changes between now and 2025 is the video generation space. That really hasn't, in my opinion, kind of fully taken off. And it has a lot of, there's obviously concerns there, in terms of deep fakes and concerns artists have about how they fit in that established industries. And so I think all of that there'll be a lot of discussion between now and 2025 about how all that plays out. But you've seen it even with the writer's strike, the actor strike, the director's strike. They were all resolved. I don't think we completely, I think some of the agreements are still confidential or haven't been fully disclosed. But I know a huge sticking point for all of them was how they're going to fit in to what they see as coming by 2025.
Well, that's great. This has been a wonderful talk with you. And, on behalf of my own Deep, to thank you for spending time with us. You've given us a lot of food for thought. I've been really intrigued with the adaptive layer discussion. And I think that's going to be very useful to a lot of people to see how it, drives business functionality, offerings, and what the investment calculus is. All of this wrapped up in a regulatory model of some sort. I think driven in part by the executive order, which has established some boundaries on what's important. And so I think vendors are going to go to the government agencies and help them get there. And then that knowledge will become more diffuse because it's in the government sphere, and then less proprietary in a pure private environment. Stand by. We'll have you back and talk about what's happened later in the year and how that's going to affect 2026. So, Suneil, thank you so much for your time. This was really excellent.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, Bill. Always great to chat with you.
Thanks for listening to AI and Data Law, part of the PLI Evercurrent podcast. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast represent those of the host and individuals being interviewed, and not necessarily those of PLI. For more AI-related content from the Practicing Law Institute, visit pli.edu/AIPod.